The music had not even started when Lyra Hale felt the room begin to tilt. She stood near the back wall of the great hall, pressed between a marble pillar and a crowd of Omegas dressed in silk she could never afford, and she told herself it was only the heat. Hundreds of candles burned along the walls. Hundreds of bodies moved through the space, laughing, whispering, watching each other for signs of weakness the way wolves always did, even in human form. She breathed in slowly and gripped the edge of the pillar behind her back, where no one could see her fingers shaking. It was not the heat. It had been 2 days since she had eaten anything more than a crust of bread, and that crust had gone to Milo anyway, broken into small pieces and pressed into his hand while he slept so he would find it when he woke and think their mother had left it for him. Milo was 11. He did not need to know that his sister had walked 4 miles into town and traded her only warm coat for a bottle of fever medicine, or that the medicine had cost more than the coat was worth, or that there had been nothing left over for food. He only needed to know that the fever was breaking, slowly, and that tonight, while she stood in a borrowed gown in a palace that smelled of roses and wine, he was lying in their small house with a cool cloth on his forehead, and their neighbor Nora sitting beside him, because Nora was the only person in the Hollow Pack who still remembered that the Hale family existed. Lyra had not wanted to come to the mating ball. She had told the pack elder as much, standing in his doorway with her chin lifted the way her mother had taught her, before her mother died, and left her chin lifted at nothing at all. The elder had not cared what she wanted. Attendance was required of every eligible Omega in every allied pack, and the Hollow Pack, small and poor and forgotten by the larger Wolf Nation, could not afford to insult the throne by sending no one. So Lyra had come, because someone had to, and because if she refused, the punishment would fall not on her, but on the whole pack, and the whole pack included Milo. She had borrowed the gown from Nora's daughter, who was 2 sizes smaller, so the fabric pulled tight across her shoulders and hung loose everywhere else. She had borrowed shoes that pinched. She had walked for 3 hours to reach the palace because the Hollow Pack had no carriage to spare, and she had arrived with dust on the hem of her dress and blisters rising on her heels, and she had told herself, the whole way, that none of it mattered, because no one here would look twice at a starving Omega from a pack no one respected. She had been right about that, mostly. For the first hour, no one looked at her at all. The hall itself was the kind of beautiful that made her chest ache. Golden light poured down from chandeliers the size of carriages. Long tables held more food than the entire Hollow Pack ate in a month. Roasted meats and towers of fruit and pastries dusted with sugar that caught the candlelight like snow. Lyra had made herself stand far from the tables, because she did not trust her own hands not to reach for something the moment no one was watching, and stealing food at the king's mating ball was the kind of mistake that could get a person exiled, or worse. So she stood by the pillar instead, and watched, and grew hungrier, and told herself it would be over soon. Around her, the other Omegas buzzed with anticipation. She caught pieces of their conversation without meaning to. They say he has rejected every single candidate for 3 years running. My cousin says he barely looks at anyone. He just stands there like a stone wall until the whole thing is over. Tonight is different, though. My father heard from the palace steward that the king has been told he must choose. The council is losing patience. If he does not choose tonight, they say the elders will start choosing for him. Lyra half listened, the way a person listens to rain on a roof, present but far away. She had no interest in the Alpha King's marriage troubles. She had walked 3 hours on blistered feet for the crime of being born into a poor pack, and all she wanted was to survive the required hours of standing, bow when required, and walk the 3 hours home before dawn, so she could relieve Nora and sit beside her brother's bed herself. A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle at first, like wind bending a field of grass, then unmistakable. Conversations dropped in volume. Bodies turned, almost in unison, toward the far end of the hall, where a set of towering doors had opened. Lyra turned too, because it was impossible not to. He entered without any announcement, without any fanfare, and yet the entire room seemed to bend toward him the moment he crossed the threshold, the way a compass needle bends toward the north whether it wants to or not. Alpha King Draven Ashwood was tall, in a way that made the space around him feel smaller, broad through the shoulders, dressed in black, that had no ornament on it at all, no crown, no chain of office, nothing but the sheer weight of who he was. His hair was dark, cut short and simple, His face was carved from something hard, unreadable. The face of a man who had learned a long time ago that showing nothing was safer than showing anything at all. Lyra had heard the stories, the way everyone had. The Alpha King who had taken the throne young, after his father died in a border conflict that still got spoken of in low voices. The Alpha King who had never lost a challenge, never shown mercy to an enemy, never once, in 3 years of mating balls, chosen a mate from the endless parade of eligible Omegas paraded in front of him. Some said he could not feel the mate bond at all, that whatever part of a wolf recognized its match had been broken in him somewhere along the way. Others said he simply did not want to feel it, that he had learned, the way kings sometimes did, that wanting things led to losing them. He moved through the crowd like a man walking through fog he had no interest in, greeting no one, stopping for no one, and settled finally near the raised dais at the head of the hall, where he stood with his hands clasped behind his back and looked out over the crowd with an expression that could have belonged to a man watching rain fall on a window. Bored, distant, waiting for something to end. Lyra watched him for exactly as long as it took to realize she was staring, and then she made herself look away, because staring at kings was another way to get noticed, and being noticed was the last thing she wanted tonight. The hunger came back the moment her attention left him. It came back worse than before, a hollow, grinding ache that spread up from her stomach into her chest, into her arms, into the base of her skull, until the golden light of the chandeliers began to flicker at the edges of her vision, not because the candles were flickering, but because something behind her eyes was. She pressed her back harder against the pillar. She counted her breaths. She thought of Milo's fever breaking, of the way his small hand had curled around hers before she left, of the promise she had made him that she would come home safe. Stand still, she told herself. Stand still and it will pass. It always passes. It did not pass. The music began, somewhere far away and yet impossibly loud, a swell of strings that seemed to press against her skull from every direction at once. The crowd began to move around her in patterns she could no longer follow, silk skirts and dark coats blurring together into a river of color with no edges. She heard her own heartbeat before she heard anything else, a heavy, uneven drum that seemed to be losing its rhythm, the way a dying fire loses its heat. She thought, distantly, that she should sit down. She thought, even more distantly, that there was nowhere in this entire glittering hall for a girl like her to sit. The floor tilted. It was such a strange sensation, the floor tilting, as if the whole palace had decided to lean sideways just to see what she would do. Lyra reached for the pillar and found only air, because her hand had already left it without her permission, and the golden light overhead scattered into 1,000 small suns, and the last coherent thought she had, before the darkness folded over her like a blanket pulled too fast, was that she hoped, whatever happened next, no one would think to check on the hollow pack, because if she did not come home tonight, there would be no one left to care for Milo at all. Then there was nothing. No floor, no candlelight, no music, only a soft, formless dark, and somewhere very far away, a sound like her own name being said by a voice she did not recognize, low and urgent, cutting through the black like a single point of heat in a frozen lake. She did not hear the gasps that rippled through the crowd around her. She did not see the way the dancing stopped, all at once, in a wave that spread outward from where she had fallen. She did not see the way every eye in the great hall turned toward the small, thin figure in a borrowed gown crumpled on the marble floor, or the way whispers began instantly, ugly and quick, the kind of whispers that always followed misfortune in rooms full of people who had never known hunger themselves. She did not see the king move, but he moved. He moved the way wolves move, when something in them recognizes danger before the mind has finished understanding it, a burst of speed that closed the length of the great hall in the space of 2 heartbeats. So fast that half the room would later swear they had not seen him cross the floor at all, only that one moment he had been standing near the dais with his arms folded and his face like stone, and the next moment he was kneeling on the marble beside a stranger in a borrowed gown, catching her just before her head could strike the ground. His hands closed around her, one bracing her back, one cradling the back of her skull, and the whole hall seemed to hold its breath at once, waiting to see what the Alpha King who felt nothing for anyone would do with a fainting Omega from a pack too small for anyone to name. For a long moment, Draven did not move at all. He knelt there on the cold marble floor, holding a girl he had never seen before in his life, and something in his chest, that had been silent for 3 long years, opened without warning, the way a door opens, when the wind finally finds the right angle to push it. It was not simply concern. It was not simply the reflex of a strong wolf catching a falling stranger. It was something older than that, something that lived beneath conscious thought, in the part of him that was still, underneath the crown and the armor and the carefully built stillness of his face. An animal that recognized its own the instant it caught her scent. He did not understand it yet. He only knew that his hands would not let go. Around him, the great hall had gone utterly silent, hundreds of nobles and omegas and pack representatives frozen mid-motion, watching their king kneel on the floor of his own ballroom, with a stranger cradled against his chest, and not one of them dared to speak first. The great hall stayed frozen, for the space of 3 long breaths, and then the king spoke, and his voice cut through the silence like a blade through still water. "Get a healer, now." No one moved fast enough for him. He rose from the floor with the girl still in his arms, lifting her as though she weighed nothing at all, though anyone standing close enough could see how thin she truly was beneath the borrowed gown, how sharply her wrist bones showed where her arm had fallen against his chest. A ripple of shock passed through the crowd again, quieter this time, made of whispers rather than gasps. No one had ever seen the Alpha King touch anyone, with anything but cold formality. No one had ever seen him carry a person in his own arms, in front of his entire court, without so much as a glance at who might be watching. He did not spare a glance at who was watching now either. He carried her straight through the parting crowd, past the raised dais, through a side door guarded by 2 of his personal wolves, who fell into step behind him, without a single question, because a look from their king in that moment was answer enough for any question they might have had. The music, which had faltered and died the moment Lyra collapsed, did not start again. Somewhere behind him, Draven heard the low murmur of the court, trying to make sense of what it had just witnessed, and he found, with a strange and unfamiliar clarity, that he did not care in the slightest what they made of it. He carried her up a wide staircase, down a corridor lined with old portraits of kings who had come before him, and into a set of private chambers that had not held another living soul in longer than he cared to remember. He laid her down on the bed with a gentleness that surprised even himself, as though some part of him understood, without being told, that this particular stranger had been handled roughly enough by life already. Only then, standing over her in the low lamplight, did he let himself breathe in fully. Her scent hit him like a wave breaking over rock. It was faint, layered beneath dust, and the road, and the plain soap of a household that could not afford anything finer, but underneath all of that, it was unmistakable, warm, clean, something like sun-warmed grass after rain, something like the first quiet hour of morning before the rest of the world woke up. It settled into his chest and did not leave, the way certain sounds settle into a room, and change the shape of the silence around them. Draven had felt nothing, for 3 years, standing in front of hundreds of eligible omegas paraded before him at ball after ball, each one dressed more finely than the last, each one trained from birth to catch a king's eye. He had begun to believe, quietly, in the parts of himself he showed no one, that whatever mechanism was supposed to recognize a fated mate had simply failed in him, broken by something in his blood, or his upbringing, or the particular cruelty of being born to rule, before he had finished learning how to live. He had not expected to find the answer kneeling on a ballroom floor, catching a stranger before her skull could crack against marble. He stood very still, watching her breathe, and felt something in his chest that he did not have a name for yet, something that made the careful stillness he had spent years constructing feel suddenly, uselessly fragile. A knock sounded at the door, sharp and urgent. "Your Majesty, the healer is here." Draven stepped back from the bed, not far, only far enough to allow the healer room to work, and found that some part of him refused to move any further than that. "Let her in," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. The healer, an older woman named Mirella, who had served the palace for longer than Draven had been alive, entered with quick, efficient steps, and set her bag down beside the bed without wasting a single motion. She pressed 2 fingers to Lyra's wrist, then leaned close to check her breathing, and within moments her expression settled into something Draven recognized immediately, because he had worn a version of it himself countless times in the field, examining wounded soldiers who had marched too long without food or water. She has fainted from exhaustion, Morella said, not looking up from her work. And hunger. Real hunger, Your Majesty. Not the kind that comes from skipping a single meal. This girl has been without proper food for some time. She checked Lyra's pulse again, frowning slightly. Her body is weak. Whoever she belongs to has not been feeding her. Something dark moved through Draven's chest at those words. Something that felt disturbingly close to anger, though he could not have said, in that moment, exactly who or what he was angry at. Will she be well? With rest and proper food, yes. She needs broth first, something light, and then real meals, slowly, so her body can accept them again. Nothing rich, not tonight. Her stomach will not forgive her for it. Morella finally looked up, studying the king's face with the frank curiosity of someone who had known him since he was a boy, and had earned the right to speak plainly. You caught her yourself. Half the hall is talking about nothing else. She was falling, Draven said, as though that explained everything, as though the explanation were as simple and complete as the sentence made it sound. Morella's eyes lingered on him a moment longer than necessary, and something in her expression softened, though she said nothing more about it. I will have broth sent up immediately. She should wake within the hour, once her body has had a chance to settle. I would suggest, Your Majesty, that you have food ready when she does. A girl this hungry will wake frightened before she wakes anything else. Draven nodded once, and Morella gathered her things and left as quickly as she had arrived, closing the door softly behind her. Alone again, Draven pulled a chair close to the bed and sat, though sitting still had never come easily to him, not even as a boy. He found himself watching the slow rise and fall of the stranger's chest, counting each breath the way a man counts something precious he is afraid of losing count of. Her hair had come loose from its pins during the fall, dark strands spread across the pillow, and in the lamplight her face looked younger than he had first thought, younger and thinner, and marked, in small ways, by a kind of tiredness that went deeper than one bad night. Who are you? He thought, and did not know if the question was meant for her or for himself. Who are you, and why does my chest ache like this, just from watching you breathe? He had spent 3 years being told, by his council, by the pack elders, by his own mother before she passed, that the mate bond was a matter of duty as much as feeling, that a king did not have the luxury of waiting for some mythical spark to strike him, the way it struck ordinary wolves in ordinary lives. He had let himself believe that the spark simply was not coming for him, that whatever was broken in his ability to feel it was a fair price to pay for the crown he carried. Sitting there, watching a stranger breathe in his own private chambers, he understood, with a certainty that settled into his bones and refused to leave, that nothing in him had ever been broken at all. It had simply been waiting. A servant arrived with a tray of broth exactly as Morella had promised, setting it on the table beside the bed with a quick bow, before retreating without a word. Draven did not touch the tray. He sat instead, and watched, and waited. And when Lyra's eyelids finally began to flutter, some long while later, he found that his heart was beating harder than it had in any battle he could remember, harder than it had the day he took the crown from his father's cold hands, harder than it had ever beaten for anything at all in his entire careful, guarded life. Whatever this stranger turned out to be, whatever poor Pack had sent her here in a dress that did not fit her, and shoes that had clearly blistered her feet along the way, Draven already knew, with a certainty that frightened him slightly, that he was not going to let her leave. Lyra woke slowly, the way a person wakes from a dream they are not ready to leave, and for a moment she simply lay still, letting her senses return to her one at a time. Soft sheets beneath her, a pillow that smelled faintly of cedar, and something warmer underneath that, something she could not name. A low lamp burning somewhere to her left, casting gentle light across a ceiling far too high and far too finely carved to belong to anything she had ever slept beneath before. Panic arrived a half-second later, sharp and immediate. She sat up too fast, and the room spun gently around her, and a strong hand caught her shoulder before she could tip sideways off the edge of the bed. Slowly, a low voice said, "You fainted. You are safe." Lyra's eyes found the source of the voice, and her breath caught somewhere in her throat and refused to move. The Alpha King sat beside her bed, close enough that she could see the fine detail of the black fabric at his collar, close enough to see that his eyes, which she had assumed from a distance to be simply dark, were in fact a deep, storm-colored gray, the color of the sky just before rain. He was watching her with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the mattress, an attention so complete and so unblinking that she felt, for a strange, dizzy moment, as though she were the only other person in the entire world. "Your Majesty," she managed, and her voice came out cracked and small, and she immediately tried to sit up further, tried to swing her legs off the bed, tried to do something, anything, that resembled the proper deference a girl from the Hollow Pack owed to the man who ruled every pack in the realm. "I am so sorry. I don't know what happened. I should not be here. You should stay exactly where you are," Draven said, and though his voice was quiet, there was something in it that made argument feel impossible, some current of authority, so natural to him that he likely did not even notice he was using it. "You fainted from hunger. The healer says you have not eaten properly in some time." Shame rose in Lyra's chest so fast and so hot that it nearly overtook the panic. Of all the ways to disgrace herself in front of the throne, of all the ways the Hollow Pack could be embarrassed in front of the entire Wolf Nation, she had managed to find the very worst one, collapsing in the middle of the mating ball like a beggar too weak to stand among her betters. "I am sorry," she said again, and hated how thin her own voice sounded. "I did not mean to trouble you. If you will allow me to return home, I will not." "You will not be going anywhere until you have eaten," Draven said, and something about the flat certainty of it silenced her, more effectively than any order could have. He reached for the tray on the bedside table, the broth long gone cold, and set it aside with an irritated glance, as though its coldness were a personal failure of the palace kitchens. "I will have something fresh brought up, something you can actually keep down." "You don't have to. I am aware of what I have to do," he said, and though the words could have sounded harsh, they did not. Not from him. Not in that low, steady voice that seemed entirely unused to being questioned, and mildly surprised to find itself being questioned now. "I am choosing to." Lyra did not know what to say to that. She had spent her entire life being told, by circumstance if not by cruelty, that she was easily overlooked, easily forgotten, the kind of person whose absence from a room made very little difference to anyone in it. She did not have the language for a king who chose, with apparent deliberateness, to sit beside her bed and personally see to her meals. He rose and crossed to the door, spoke a quiet instruction to someone waiting outside, and returned to his chair with the same unhurried economy of movement she had noticed in every gesture he made, as though he had long ago learned that wasted motion was simply another form of weakness he could not afford. "What is your name?" "Lyra," she said. "Lyra Hale, from the Hollow Pack." Something flickered behind his eyes at the name of her pack, though she could not have said what, and she found herself bracing instinctively for the look of dismissal she had grown so used to seeing on the faces of anyone from a stronger, richer pack, the moment they learned where she came from. The Hollow Pack was small and poor, tucked into a valley too rocky for good farming, too far from any trade route to prosper the way larger packs did. People from the Hollow Pack were not laughed at, exactly, not to their faces, but they were forgotten quickly, the way small, unremarkable things are always forgotten quickly. The look of dismissal did not come. "The Hollow Pack," Draven repeated, as though turning the words over to examine them more closely. "I have read the reports. Your pack has struggled for several seasons. Poor harvests. A shortage of healers." Lyra blinked, startled that he knew anything at all about her pack, let alone details specific enough to name. "You read reports about us?" "I read reports about every pack in the realm," he said, which was true, though it was not the whole truth, and even he seemed to sense that his answer had come out sounding colder than he intended, because he added, after a short pause, "Tell me why you had not eaten." It was not a request. Lyra understood that immediately, understood that whatever gentleness he had shown so far did not extend to letting the question go unanswered. She looked down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap, and found, to her own surprise, that the words came easier than she expected, perhaps because he was a stranger, perhaps because there was something in the steadiness of his attention that made honesty feel safer than pretense. "My brother is sick," she said quietly. "Milo, he is 11. He had a fever that would not break, and the medicine cost more than we had, so I traded what I could, and used the rest of our food money on it. There was nothing left over for meals, not for a few days. I did not mind it for myself. I only worried about him." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Lyra risked a glance up, afraid she had said something wrong, something that had offended him or bored him or otherwise cost her whatever fragile goodwill she had somehow earned. What she found instead was an expression on the Alpha King's face that she did not have a word for, something that looked almost like anger, though she understood quickly that it was not directed at her at all. "You gave your food to your brother," he said, not quite a question. He needed it more. "And no one in your pack thought to make sure you ate as well?" Lyra hesitated. It was not a simple question, not really, because the honest answer involved a great many small failures that had accumulated, over years, into something that felt too large and too shameful to name aloud to a king. Her mother had died 2 winters ago. Her father had left even before that, gone to find work in a richer pack and never returned. Whether by choice or misfortune, she had never learned. What remained of her family was herself and Milo, and the small kindness of neighbors like Nora, who had little enough to spare themselves. "We manage," she said finally, which was not an answer, and which they both seemed to understand was not an answer, and which Draven, to her relief, did not press further. A knock came at the door, and a servant entered with a fresh tray, this one holding a simple bowl of warm broth, a small plate of soft bread, and a cup of something pale and sweet-smelling that Lyra did not recognize. The servant set it down and retreated without a word, and Draven pulled the tray closer and, to Lyra's astonishment, picked up the spoon himself. "I can feed myself, Your Majesty," she said quickly, reaching for it, though her hand was still unsteady enough that he did not immediately relinquish it. "I know you can," he said, and something in his tone, some small, unfamiliar warmth she had not expected from him, made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. "Humor me." She did not understand, in that moment, why a king who had reportedly rejected every candidate presented to him for 3 years would sit beside the bed of a starving stranger from an unimportant pack and insist on feeding her himself, spoonful by careful spoonful, watching her the entire time, with an attention so focused it made her skin feel warm beneath it. She did not understand the way his jaw tightened, very slightly, every time she winced from the ache of a stomach unused to food, as though her discomfort cost him something he had not expected to spend. She did not understand any of it, not yet, but she found, somewhere between the 3rd spoonful and the 5th, that she had stopped being afraid of him entirely, and had started, instead, to feel something far more dangerous and far more confusing, the quiet, unfamiliar sense of being safe. Draven did not understand himself either, not fully, not yet. He only knew that every instinct in him, every carefully buried piece of the wolf beneath the crown, was telling him the same single, undeniable truth, over and over, with each spoonful he lifted to her lips. "Mine. She is mine. I will not let her go hungry again." He had no explanation for the bond yet, no proof beyond the pull in his chest, and the way her scent had settled into his lungs, like something he never wanted to breathe out. But he did not need proof. He had spent 3 years waiting for a feeling he had begun to believe would never come, and now that it had arrived, kneeling on a ballroom floor with a stranger in his arms, he had no intention of questioning it, and even less intention of letting it walk out of his palace and back into a life that had clearly, cruelly, failed to feed her. Whatever came next, whatever the council said or the court whispered, Draven had already made his decision, somewhere between catching her fall and watching her eat, and it was a decision he did not plan to unmake for anyone. By the time Lyra had finished the broth and most of the bread, the shaking in her hands had settled, and a kind of clarity had returned to her thinking that made the last hour feel almost like a fever dream she was only now waking fully from. She was sitting in the private chambers of the Alpha King. He had carried her here himself. He had fed her from his own hand. None of it made any sense, and yet here she was. "Thank you," she said quietly, setting the empty bowl aside, "for all of this. I don't know why you troubled yourself, but I am grateful." Draven studied her for a long moment before he answered, and when he spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier steadiness, replaced by something more careful, almost hesitant, an uncertainty that seemed foreign on a man who wore command as easily as he wore his own skin. "Do you know what happens when a wolf finds their fated mate?" Lyra's stomach, only just settled, dropped all over again. "I have heard stories. My mother used to speak of it. She said you know instantly. The moment you catch their scent, the way you know the sun has risen, even with your eyes closed. That is close to true, Draven said. For most wolves, the pull is immediate and undeniable. For some, particularly those who carry a great deal of duty, or a great deal of grief, the bond can be harder to recognize. I had begun to believe mine simply did not exist. That whatever part of me was meant to feel it had been lost somewhere along the way. Lyra did not understand, at first, why he was telling her this, why the Alpha King of the entire wolf nation would sit at her bedside and speak so plainly about something so private. And then, slowly, the shape of what he was not quite saying began to form in her mind, and her breath caught somewhere in her chest. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "what are you telling me?" "I am telling you," Draven said, holding her gaze without flinching, the way he had learned, long ago, to hold the gaze of anyone he needed to be understood by, that the moment I touched you, on that ballroom floor, I felt something I have not felt in 3 years, of standing in front of every eligible Omega in this realm. I am telling you that your scent settled into me the instant I caught you, and it has not left since, and I do not believe it intends to. The room went very quiet. Somewhere beyond the tall windows, the sounds of the ball continued faintly, music and laughter drifting up from a world that suddenly felt very far away, and very unimportant. "That isn't possible," Lyra said, though her voice shook slightly as she said it. "I am no one. I am from the Hollow Pack. We have nothing. We are nothing. The entire realm barely remembers we exist. You are the Alpha King. You could have anyone in this kingdom." "The bond does not care what I could have," Draven said. "It has never cared about rank, or wealth, or which pack raised its future mate. It cares only about the truth of what two wolves are to each other, and mine has told me, in the clearest terms I have ever received about anything in my life, that the truth is you." Lyra stared at him, searching his face for some sign that this was a cruel joke, some test of a poor Omega's foolishness that the court would laugh about tomorrow. She found nothing of the kind. His expression held the same steady, unwavering focus he had shown since the moment she woke, an intensity that had nothing performative in it at all, nothing that suggested a man playing games with a girl too weak and too tired to defend herself. "I don't know what to say," she admitted finally. "You do not need to say anything tonight," Draven said, and something in his voice gentled, just slightly, enough that she felt the change like warmth against her skin. "You need to rest. You need to eat properly, and sleep in a bed that will not leave you hungry when you wake. Whatever this bond means for the future, it can wait until you are strong enough to think clearly about it." "And if I decide it means nothing?" she asked, though even as she said it, some part of her already knew the question was not entirely honest, because something had shifted in her own chest as well, somewhere between his hand catching her shoulder and the careful way he had lifted the spoon to her lips, something warm and unfamiliar, and entirely too large to examine so soon. "Then I will have to accept that," Draven said, though the words seemed to cost him something to say, however difficult I might find it. "But I do not think that is what will happen, Lyra Hale. I think you felt it too, the moment I caught you, even if you have not yet found the words for it." She did not answer, because he was right, and because admitting it aloud felt like stepping off a cliff into water she could not see the bottom of. Instead, she looked down at her hands, still faintly trembling, and let the silence stretch between them, comfortable in a way she had not expected silence with a king to ever be. "My brother," she said finally, because it was the one thing she could not let herself forget, no matter how strange and overwhelming this night had become. "He is still sick. I need to go home to him. Nora is watching him, but she has her own family, her own worries. I cannot stay here, not even for a fated bond, not while he needs me." Something settled in Draven's expression, a decision forming behind his eyes with the same quiet certainty he brought to every choice he made. "Then we will bring him here." "Your Majesty, I could not possibly ask." "You are not asking. I am offering." He rose from the chair, and though the movement was simple, there was something final in it, the closing of one conversation, and the opening of another. "I will send my personal healer to the Hollow Pack tonight, along with an escort to bring your brother to the palace, where he can be cared for properly. You will not have to choose between staying here and returning to him. I will not allow that choice to fall on you." Lyra felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been held tightly closed for so long, She had almost forgotten it was there at all. A hope so unfamiliar it felt almost painful. Why would you do this for us? You don't even know us. I know that you gave your own food to a sick child, rather than let him go hungry, Draven said. I know that you walked hours in shoes that clearly do not fit you, to attend a ball you did not want to attend, because your pack could not afford to refuse the throne's summons. I know that when I caught you falling, my chest opened in a way it has not opened in longer than I care to remember. That is enough for me to know exactly what kind of person you are, Lyra Hale, and exactly what kind of life I intend to make sure you never have to live again. Lyra did not have words for what rose in her chest at that, something too large and too new to name, part disbelief, part gratitude, part a warmth that felt dangerously close to something else entirely. She only nodded, because speaking felt suddenly impossible, and watched as the Alpha King crossed to the door and issued a series of quiet, efficient instructions to the guards waiting outside, arranging, with the same unhurried authority he brought to everything, for a healer and an escort to travel through the night to a small, forgotten pack in a rocky valley, to bring home a sick boy she loved more than her own life. She did not know yet what any of this meant for her future, or what the court would say when they learned the Alpha King had chosen an Omega from the poorest pack in the realm. She did not know about the enemies already beginning to whisper in the shadowed corners of the great hall below, or the trials that still waited ahead of her. She only knew, watching Draven's broad shoulders as he stood in the doorway giving orders on her behalf, that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not alone in carrying the weight of her family's survival, and that the ache in her chest, the one that had nothing to do with hunger, was not fear at all. It was the first, fragile shape of something that felt very much like hope. Milo arrived at the palace just before dawn, carried on a litter by two of the king's own guards, with Mirella walking alongside him the entire way, checking his fever every few minutes with the careful attention of a healer who had been given a direct order from her king and did not intend to disappoint him. Lyra was waiting at the palace gates when they arrived, having refused to sleep until her brother was safely inside the walls, and the moment she saw his small, pale face peeking out from beneath the blankets, something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 2 days finally let go. Lyra? Milo's voice was weak but clear, his eyes wide as he took in the towering palace walls around him, the guards in their fine uniforms, the sheer scale of a world he had never imagined he would see. Where are we? Is this a dream? It's not a dream, Lyra said, kneeling beside the litter and taking his small hand in both of hers. You're safe. We're both safe. You're going to get better here. Milo's fever broke fully by midday, helped along by proper medicine and a warm, dry bed, and food that did not have to be rationed into careful pieces. By the time evening came, he was sitting up in a guest chamber down the hall from Lyra's own rooms, eating soup with the enthusiastic focus of a boy who had spent too many days too sick to enjoy anything at all, and asking Lyra 100 questions about the palace, about the king, about whether it was true that wolves as big as horses guarded the gates at night. Draven visited that evening, standing in the doorway of Milo's chamber with a stiffness that suggested he was not entirely certain how to address an 11-year-old boy, king or not. Milo, entirely undaunted by the presence of the most powerful alpha in the realm, looked up from his soup and asked, with the blunt honesty only children seem to possess, "Are you going to marry my sister?" Lyra's face went red. Draven, to her surprise, did not look flustered at all. He crossed the room, settled into the chair beside the bed with the same unhurried composure he brought to every decision, and answered as though the question deserved the same careful consideration he gave to matters of state. "I intend to try," he said, "if she will have me." Milo considered this with the seriousness of a much older person weighing a difficult decision. "She works too hard," he said finally. "She never eats enough, because she always makes sure I eat first. If you marry her, you have to make sure someone makes her eat, because she won't do it herself." "I intend to make that my personal responsibility," Draven said, and something in his voice, some quiet gravity beneath the simple words, made Lyra's chest ache, in a way that had nothing to do with embarrassment at all. It was in the days that followed that the full shape of what had happened at the mating ball began to settle over the palace, spreading outward from the great hall into every corner of the court, carried on 1,000 whispering tongues that could not agree on whether what they had witnessed was a scandal or a miracle. The Alpha King, who had rejected every candidate for 3 years, who had shown no warmth to any Omega presented before him, had caught a fainting stranger from an unimportant pack and had not let her out of his sight since. Draven addressed the court formally, 3 days after the ball, standing on the same dais where he had once looked out over the crowd with cold indifference, with Lyra standing beside him, in a gown that had been made for her specifically, fitted to her own measurements for the first time, in longer than she could remember. She was still thin, still recovering, but color had returned to her face, and when Draven took her hand in front of the assembled nobles and pack representatives, and announced, without hesitation, that he had found his fated mate, his voice carried a certainty that left no room for argument. "I present to you, Lyra Hale, of the Hollow Pack," he said, his voice ringing clear through the great hall, "my mate, and the future queen of this realm." The reaction was immediate and mixed. A portion of the crowd, those who valued the ancient laws of the mate bond above all else, erupted into applause, moved by the rare and undeniable proof of true fate finding its match. Others, particularly among the wealthier packs, who had spent years positioning their own daughters as potential candidates, exchanged glances that were considerably less warm, whispers passing between them like a cold wind moving through dry leaves. Lyra felt every one of those cold glances land on her skin, and though Draven's hand remained steady around hers, offering silent reassurance, she could not shake the sense that the celebration around her was thinner than it appeared, that beneath the applause, something sharper and more dangerous was already beginning to sharpen its claws. She was right to sense it. Near the back of the hall, half hidden behind a marble column, a woman named Celine Vane watched the announcement with an expression carefully arranged into polite interest, though nothing about what she felt in that moment could have been called polite at all. Celine had spent the better part of 2 years positioning herself as the obvious choice for the throne, the daughter of one of the wealthiest packs in the realm, raised from childhood specifically to become queen, trained in every art of courtly grace and political maneuvering that such a position required. She had attended every mating ball for 3 years, had watched Draven reject candidate after candidate with a growing, private confidence that her turn would eventually come, that patience and preparation would win out where lesser Omegas had failed. She had not prepared for a starving stranger from a forgotten pack to walk in off the road and take everything she had spent years building toward in the space of a single evening. Celine's hands, folded neatly in front of her, curled into fists hidden within the fabric of her gown. She smiled, because smiling was expected, because a lifetime of training had taught her that emotion shown too openly was emotion that could be used against her. But behind the smile, something cold and calculating had already begun to turn, weighing possibilities, searching for weaknesses, looking for any thread she might pull to unravel the fragile new bond standing on the dais above her. She did not have to search long. A girl raised in poverty, thrust suddenly into a world of wealth and politics she had no experience navigating, was exactly the kind of weakness that a patient enemy could work with. Celine turned to the noblewoman standing beside her, a longtime ally named Corla, whose family had also positioned a daughter as a potential candidate, and murmured, low enough that only the two of them could hear, "It seems our king has made quite an interesting choice." "An unfortunate one," Corla agreed quietly. "A pack that cannot even feed its own people. What does that suggest to you about her character, or her family's honor?" "It suggests," Celine said, watching Lyra's uncertain smile from across the hall, with an expression that gave nothing away, "that this particular queen may need a great deal of help finding her footing in a court she was never prepared for. And help, of course, comes in many forms." Corla's lips curved into a small, understanding smile of her own. Neither of them said anything more. Not there. Not in a hall full of listening ears. But the seed had been planted, and both women understood exactly what kind of harvest they intended to grow from it. On the dais, unaware of the quiet conversation unfolding in the shadows below, Lyra felt the weight of Draven's hand around hers, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to believe that the worst of her troubles had already passed. She did not yet understand that the great hall of the palace, for all its golden light and glittering finery, could be just as unforgiving a battlefield as any her new king had ever fought on, and that the enemies waiting for her there did not carry swords, but something far more dangerous: patience, position, and the quiet, practiced art of turning a court against a stranger it had never wanted to accept. The weeks that followed the formal announcement settled into a rhythm Lyra had never known before, one built around lessons rather than labor, around learning the names of noble families rather than learning which roots were safe to eat when the harvest failed. A tutor named Elric arrived each morning to instruct her in the histories of the great packs, the proper forms of address for visiting dignitaries, the delicate, unspoken rules of a court that had spent centuries building walls she was expected to learn to climb in a matter of months. She applied herself to all of it with the same quiet determination she had once applied to stretching a single loaf of bread across an entire week, and Draven, watching her from across the room during lessons he rarely had time to attend in full, found himself continually struck by how quickly she absorbed each new piece of knowledge, how carefully she turned every lesson over in her mind before setting it aside, satisfied only when she understood it completely. "You do not have to master everything at once," he told her one evening, finding her still bent over a stack of texts on pack lineages long after the rest of the palace had gone quiet for the night. "The court will forgive small mistakes from a new queen. They will not expect perfection." "They will expect exactly that," Lyra said, without looking up from the page. "I have heard the way some of them speak when they think I cannot hear. They are waiting for me to fail, Draven. I do not intend to give them the satisfaction." She was not wrong. The whispers had not stopped since the night of the announcement. If anything, they had grown more elaborate, more pointed, weaving themselves through the corridors of the palace like smoke that never quite cleared. Some claimed that Lyra had used some old, forbidden trick to force the mate bond into existence, that no true fate would ever choose a girl from a pack too weak to feed itself. Others simply mocked her manners, her plain speech, the small, telling mistakes that marked her as someone who had not been raised for this life, seizing on every stumble as proof that she did not belong. Selene Vane, for her part, played her role with a patience that would have impressed even the most experienced court schemer. She never spoke against Lyra directly, never allowed herself to be caught in anything that could be called an insult. Instead, she offered small, seemingly generous gestures, a suggestion here, a piece of advice there, each one carefully designed to lead Lyra into some minor embarrassment that would spread through the court within hours. It was Selene who suggested, with apparent kindness, that Lyra wear a particular shade of deep crimson to a gathering of visiting pack elders, a color that Lyra later learned, from a horrified maid, was traditionally worn only in mourning, a color that had turned the entire evening into a quiet, whispered scandal about the new queen's ignorance of even the most basic court customs. It was Selene who mentioned, in a tone of careful concern, that a particular elder from a distant pack preferred to be addressed by an old, ceremonial title, one that had fallen out of common use decades earlier, leaving Lyra to stumble through an introduction that made her sound, to every listening ear, exactly as unprepared as her enemies wished her to appear. Lyra did not immediately understand the pattern. She only knew that each week seemed to bring some new small disaster, some fresh whisper following in her wake, and that no matter how hard she studied, no matter how carefully she practiced, the court continued to find fresh reasons to doubt her. It was Nora, arrived at the palace to help care for Milo, and to offer Lyra the comfort of one familiar face, in an unfamiliar world, who first noticed the pattern for what it truly was. "That woman is not your friend," Nora said one afternoon, watching from a window as Selene crossed the courtyard below, moving with the easy grace of someone who had never once in her life gone hungry. "I have seen this before, child, in smaller ways, among smaller people. She smiles at you and hands you a knife, disguised as a gift, and by the time you realize what you are holding, you have already cut yourself with it." "She has been nothing but kind to me," Lyra said, though even as she said it, doubt had already begun to creep into her voice. "Kindness does not leave a trail of humiliation behind it," Nora said. "Think carefully, Lyra. Every piece of advice she has given you, every gesture of friendship, has it helped you, or has it left you standing alone in a room full of people laughing behind their hands?" Lyra thought back over the past weeks, over the crimson gown and the wrong title, and a dozen smaller missteps she had assumed were simply her own ignorance, her own failure to master a world too foreign and too fast for her to learn quickly enough. Slowly, painfully, the pattern Nora described began to take shape in her mind, each small disaster arranging itself into a line that led directly back to Selene Vane's carefully arranged smiles. "Why would she do this?" Lyra asked. though some part of her had already guessed the answer. Because you have something she wanted, Nora said simply, and people who lose what they believe they were owed rarely lose gracefully. That evening, Lyra said nothing to Draven about her suspicions. She was not yet certain enough of the pattern to make an accusation against a noblewoman with powerful family connections, not without proof, not without risking her own already fragile standing in a court that would leap at any excuse to call her hysterical, or ungrateful, or unfit for the crown she had been given. Instead, she watched, more carefully than before, noting every conversation, every carefully worded suggestion, every small kindness that arrived, wrapped around a hidden edge. She did not have to wait long for the pattern to sharpen into something undeniable. Celine's next move came during a formal dinner held for the visiting elders of the Ridgeback Pack, one of the largest and most influential packs in the realm, whose support Draven had spent considerable effort cultivating in recent months, for reasons of border security and trade. Celine arrived early, before Lyra, and spent several long minutes in quiet, apparently friendly conversation with the Ridgeback elder's wife, a stern woman named Halvard's mother, whose good opinion mattered a great deal to the stability of the kingdom's northern borders. By the time Lyra entered the dining hall, the seeds of that conversation had already been planted, and she spent the entire evening confused by the cold, suspicious glances the Ridgeback elders directed her way, unable to understand what she had done to earn such open hostility from guests she had not yet even properly greeted. It was only later, from a sympathetic servant who had overheard the earlier conversation, that Lyra learned what Celine had said. She had suggested, gently, almost regretfully, that the new queen came from a pack with a history of broken alliances, that the Hollow Pack had once, generations ago, failed to honor a trade agreement with a neighboring pack during a difficult season, a debt of honor that had technically never been formally resolved. It was ancient history, barely remembered, entirely irrelevant to Lyra herself, who had not even been born when the incident occurred. But planted carefully in the ear of a proud, traditional elder's wife, it had been more than enough to poison an entire evening. Lyra left the dinner shaking with a fury she had rarely allowed herself to feel, not at the insult itself, which she might have shrugged off on her own behalf, but at the danger it posed to Draven, to the fragile alliance he had worked so hard to build, all because one bitter woman could not accept that fate had chosen someone other than herself. She found Draven in his study later that night, still awake over a stack of reports, and told him everything, every small incident of the past weeks laid out in careful order, watching his expression darken with each new detail. "I should have seen this sooner," he said, when she finished, his voice low and controlled, in the particular way she had learned meant he was furious beneath the surface. "I have been so consumed with council matters that I did not notice my own court turning against you beneath my roof." "It is not your fault," Lyra said. "She is careful. She never says anything that can be traced directly back to her." "Careful or not," Draven said, rising from his desk with a stillness that felt more dangerous than any shout could have. "She has made a serious mistake tonight. She has interfered with matters of state, not simply matters of court gossip. That is no longer something I can allow to continue unanswered." Lyra felt a flicker of unease at the hard set of his jaw, the particular quiet that had settled over him, the quiet of a king, deciding exactly how much weight to bring down on an enemy who had finally overstepped. She did not yet know what he intended to do, only that the careful, patient game Celine Vane had been playing was about to collide, very soon, with a force considerably less patient than her own. Draven did not act rashly, whatever the fury simmering beneath his composure might have suggested to anyone watching him closely enough. He had spent too many years learning the difference between swift justice and reckless justice, and he understood, even through his anger, that moving against Celine Vane, without solid proof, would only hand her exactly the kind of sympathy she needed to survive the accusation. So he waited, and he watched, and he set quiet inquiries in motion that Celine never noticed, because she had grown so confident in her own cleverness that the possibility of being discovered had stopped occurring to her at all. The proof, when it came, arrived from an unexpected source. One of Celine's own household servants, a young woman named Petra who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the tasks her mistress asked of her, approached Morella the healer under the cover of a routine visit and confessed, in a low, frightened voice, everything she had witnessed over the past weeks. The carefully worded suggestions passed to visiting dignitaries. The false histories invented and planted like seeds in fertile soil. A letter, still in Petra's possession, drafted in Celine's own hand, outlining a plan to spread rumors questioning the legitimacy of the mate bond itself, suggesting that Lyra had somehow tricked or manipulated the king through means no honest wolf would use. Mirella brought Petra directly to Draven that same evening, and by the time the young servant finished recounting everything she knew, laying the letter on the king's desk with trembling hands, Draven's expression had gone perfectly, terrifyingly still. "You have done a brave thing, coming forward," he told Petra, his voice gentle despite the storm clearly building behind his eyes. "You will not suffer for it. I will see to your protection myself." Petra, relieved beyond words, thanked him, and was escorted away by a guard to quarters where Celine's reach could not touch her, and Draven sat alone with the letter for a long while, reading Celine's careful, damning words over and over, feeling the full weight of what her scheme could have cost him. Not simply Lyra's happiness, though that alone would have been reason enough for his fury. The letter, in its plan to question the legitimacy of the mate bond, struck at something far larger: the stability of the throne itself, the fragile trust between the crown and Pax like the Ridgeback, whose support depended on believing their king's judgment was sound and his word was true. He called Lyra to his study and showed her the letter without softening any of what it contained, because he had learned, in the short weeks since the ball, that softening the truth for Lyra only insulted the sharp, steady mind she had proven she possessed. Lyra read the letter twice, her face growing paler with each line, though her hands, Draven noted with a flicker of quiet pride, did not shake at all. "She meant to unmake everything," she said finally. "Not just embarrass me. She meant to convince the Pax that our bond was false. That would have destroyed everything you have built to keep the realm united." "Yes," Draven said simply, "which is why what happens next must be handled publicly. Quietly punishing her would only allow the rumors she has already spread to continue festering in the shadows. The court needs to see the truth laid bare, and they need to see it from you as much as from me." Lyra understood immediately what he was suggesting, and felt her stomach tighten with a fear she had not expected to feel again, so soon after the terror of that first fainting night. "You want me to stand before the entire court and defend myself. I want you to stand before the entire court and let them see exactly who you are," Draven said, "not defend yourself as though you have something to answer for. You have done nothing wrong, Lyra. Celine Vane has committed treason against the stability of this throne, and the court needs to understand that distinction clearly, in a way that leaves no room for future doubt." It was Nora, once again, who helped steady Lyra's nerves in the days that followed, sitting with her each evening, as she prepared not lessons on court etiquette this time, but the simple, unshakable truth of her own story, practiced until the words came without hesitation, without the small tremors of fear that had marked her early weeks in the palace. "You have survived worse than a room full of wealthy strangers," Nora told her, the night before the confrontation was to take place. "You have survived hunger. You have survived grief. You have kept a sick child alive on nothing but stubbornness and love. Whatever waits for you in that hall tomorrow, child, it is nothing compared to what you have already carried." Lyra held on to those words the following morning, standing once again in the great hall where everything had begun, though this time she wore a gown chosen for its simplicity, rather than its finery, plain deep blue without ornament, a deliberate echo of the modest life she had come from, and had no intention of pretending she had never lived. The court gathered in full, summoned by the king's own command, and a current of tense anticipation moved through the crowd, as they took in the sight of Draven standing on the dais with Lyra beside him, and Celine Vane, summoned separately, entering the hall with her usual composed grace, apparently unaware yet of exactly what awaited her. Draven did not waste time on preamble. 3 weeks ago, he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall, my mate collapsed before this entire court from hunger, having sacrificed her own meals to care for a sick child. I caught her. I claimed her, as fate had already claimed her for me, and I announced her as my future queen before all of you. He let the words settle, and then continued, colder now, each syllable falling like a stone into still water. Since that day, a member of this court has engaged in a deliberate, calculated campaign to undermine that bond, not through honest disagreement, which I would welcome from any of you who doubted the legitimacy of what I have declared, through lies, through manufactured scandal, through a letter, in her own hand, planning to question the very legitimacy of a fated bond in order to serve her own ambitions. Celine's composure finally cracked, a flicker of alarm passing across her carefully arranged features, as she realized, too late, exactly what was happening. Your Majesty, I do not know what you have been told, but I assure you, I have the letter, Lady Vane, Draven said, and produced it, holding it aloft where the gathered court could see the seal, unmistakably her own family's mark, pressed into the wax. Written in your own hand, detailing your intention, to convince the visiting elders of the Ridgeback Pack that my mate had somehow tricked me into a false bond. A claim that, had it spread unchecked, could have destabilized alliances this crown has spent years building. A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the hall, and Celine's face drained of color, her carefully constructed composure finally, completely collapsing under the weight of undeniable proof laid bare before the entire court. She opened her mouth, perhaps to argue, perhaps to plead, but no words came, because there were none left that could undo what the letter, in her own damning hand, had already confessed on her behalf. Draven turned from her, deliberately, and faced Lyra instead, and something in his expression shifted from cold fury to something warmer, something that made the entire hall fall silent in a different way entirely, watching their king look at his mate with an openness none of them had ever seen from him before. I did not choose Lyra Hale because a bond told me to, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. I choose her, every day since, because I have watched her carry more weight than anyone in this room has ever been asked to carry, and do it without complaint, without cruelty, and without ever once forgetting the people she loves. She has earned this crown 100 times over, not through birth or wealth, but through the strength of her own character. Any among you who continues to question that will answer to me directly. The hall remained silent for a long moment, and then, slowly, beginning with a few scattered voices and spreading outward like a tide finally turning, applause began to rise, genuine this time, no longer thin with hidden doubt, until the great hall rang with the sound of a court finally, fully accepting what their king had already known from the very first night. His hands had caught a falling stranger before she hit the ground. Celine Vane was escorted from the hall by the palace guard, her family standing in the court reduced to ruin by her own written confession, and Lyra stood on the dais beside Draven, watching her enemy's downfall with no triumph in her heart at all, only a quiet, steady relief that the truth, finally, had been allowed to stand in the light where it belonged. In the weeks after Celine Vane's disgrace, the court settled into something closer to genuine respect, and Lyra found the whispers that had once followed her through every corridor beginning, slowly, to quiet. But the ease she had hoped to feel did not fully arrive, because a new challenge had already begun forming, one that no single letter or confession could unravel. The Council of Elders, a body of ancient pack leaders whose approval was required for any formal coronation, had convened to discuss the matter of the king's chosen mate, and word reached the palace that not all of them were satisfied with a fated bond alone as sufficient reason to crown a queen. Tradition held that any mate born outside the ruling packs must prove her fitness through a formal trial, a custom so old it had not been invoked in over 100 years, set aside by generations of kings whose chosen mates had come from families powerful enough that the question never arose. Lyra came from no such family, and a faction within the council, led by an elder named Corvin Ashgrove, argued that the ancient custom existed for exactly this circumstance, a mate whose worthiness had not yet been proven by anything beyond the word of a bond no one but the king himself could feel. It is not that we doubt the king's judgment, Corvin explained, when he came before Draven to present the council's decision, his tone carefully respectful even as his words carried an edge that could not be softened. It is that the realm requires more than judgment alone to accept a queen who will one day guide its future. The trial exists to give the pack certainty. Surely a mate as worthy as you describe her has nothing to fear from proving it. Draven's fury at the suggestion was immediate and barely contained, but Lyra, standing beside him, felt something different rise in her chest, something closer to a familiar, exhausted resignation. She had spent her entire life proving her worth to people who assumed, from the moment they learned where she came from, that she had none. She had proven it to the pack elder, who doubted the Hollow Pack could send anyone presentable to the ball. She had proven it to the healers, who assumed a starving girl could not possibly understand her own brother's care. She had proven it to a court that had spent weeks looking for reasons to dismiss her. She was tired, in a way she had not let herself feel since arriving at the palace, of a world that required proof from her that it never required from anyone born into wealth. "I will not have you subjected to some archaic test, designed by men who have never gone hungry a day in their lives," Draven said that night, pacing his study with the barely restrained energy of a wolf who wanted very badly to challenge someone and had no acceptable target for that anger. "I will refuse the council's demand. My word as king should be enough." "It should be," Lyra agreed quietly, sitting by the window with her hands folded in her lap. "But it is not, Draven, and refusing outright will only give them another reason to whisper that you are hiding something, that I have something to hide. I have spent my whole life being underestimated. I do not think I can spend the rest of it wondering if this council secretly still believes I do not belong here, simply because we refuse to let them ask the question openly." Draven stopped his pacing and turned to look at her, something complicated moving behind his eyes. "You would actually submit to this?" "I would rather prove myself once, clearly, and be done with the doubt forever," Lyra said, "than live the rest of my life as queen, while men like Corvin Ashgrove whisper behind closed doors that I never truly earned it. I know what I am capable of, Draven. I am not afraid of a trial. I am afraid of a lifetime of quiet doubt that never gets the chance to be answered." It took him a long moment to accept it, and even then, his agreement came reluctantly, softened only by the fierce promise that he would be present for every part of whatever trial the council designed, and that the first sign of any unfair or dangerous demand would end the proceedings immediately, council tradition or not. The trial, when the council finally presented its terms 3 days later, proved to be less a single dramatic contest than a series of tests spread across a full turning of the moon, designed to examine every quality the ancient custom believed a queen required. Wisdom, tested through a series of disputes brought before her for judgment, real grievances between pack members that required fair and thoughtful resolution. Strength, tested not through combat, which the old laws did not require of an Omega, but through endurance, a full day spent overseeing the palace's care of the sick and injured, brought in from the surrounding lands, work that tested patience and compassion as much as physical stamina. And finally, loyalty, tested through a private audience with the council itself, where Lyra would be questioned directly about her intentions, her values, and her understanding of what ruling a realm actually required. Lyra approached each test with the same quiet determination she had once applied to stretching a single meal across an entire week, and though the days were long and often exhausting, she found, to her own surprise, that she did not dread them the way she had feared she might. The disputes brought before her reminded her, in miniature, of the years she had spent mediating small conflicts within the Hollow Pack, neighbors arguing over shared wells or borrowed tools, disagreements that required not clever politics, but honest fairness, a quality she had practiced her entire life, without ever once calling it a skill worth testing. The day spent tending the sick and injured, far from feeling like a trial at all, felt instead like coming home to something familiar, the careful, patient work of caring for people who had nothing and needed everything, work she had done for her own brother, 100 times over, without ever once being thanked for it, by anyone beyond his own small, grateful smile. It was the final audience with the council that Lyra found most difficult, not because the questions were unfair, but because Corvin Ashgrove, still unconvinced despite the weeks of steady, quiet proof she had offered, pressed her with a final question sharper than all the rest. "You come from a pack with nothing," he said, his voice carrying no cruelty, only the flat, testing weight of genuine doubt. "No wealth, no history of leadership, no tradition of rule. What could a girl raised in poverty possibly understand about guiding a realm as vast and complicated as this one?" Lyra met his gaze steadily, and found, when she spoke, that the answer had been waiting inside her for longer than she had realized, formed slowly over years of hunger and hardship that she had never once thought of as preparation for anything at all. "I understand what it costs a family when the harvest fails," she said. "I understand what it means to choose between medicine and food, and to make that choice every single day without complaint, because complaining does not fill an empty stomach. I understand what it feels like to be forgotten by the people meant to protect you, and I understand, better than anyone raised in comfort ever could, exactly what it takes to survive when the world offers no help at all. She paused, letting the weight of her own history settle over the room. You ask what a girl raised in poverty could understand about ruling a realm. I would ask instead what a realm could possibly hope to achieve if it is ruled only by those who have never once known what it means to go without. I do not offer you wealth, or lineage, or tradition. I offer you the understanding of every family in this kingdom who has ever gone to bed hungry, wondering if tomorrow would be any easier. That understanding, Elder Ashgrove, is not a weakness. It is the very thing your council should have been searching for all along. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, and then, slowly, Corvin Ashgrove inclined his head, something in his weathered face shifting from doubt into a grudging, genuine respect. Well answered, he said quietly. Better answered than I expected, and better than most candidates born into every privilege this realm can offer have ever managed. The council's approval, when it came 2 days later, was unanimous. With the council's approval secured, the palace began preparing for a formal coronation, and for the first time since the night of the mating ball, Lyra allowed herself to believe that the hardest part of her journey had finally ended. She should have known better. Fate, having tested her patience and her strength, was not yet finished testing her courage. Celine Vane's disgrace had not gone unnoticed by her family, and her father, Lord Ambrose Vane, a man whose wealth and influence had built much of his family's standing over 3 generations, had watched his daughter's carefully constructed future collapse into ruin, with a fury that had only grown colder and more dangerous with each passing week. He did not appear at court. He did not petition the king for leniency on his daughter's behalf. He simply waited, in the quiet, patient way of a man who had spent his entire life learning that the most effective strikes were the ones no one saw coming. He struck 3 days before the coronation. It began with a message delivered to the palace kitchens, forged with enough skill to pass as an official request from the Queen's own household, instructing that a small party be prepared to escort young Milo Hale on a supervised outing to the palace gardens, a simple, ordinary pleasure that Lyra had indeed granted her brother several times before, as his health continued to improve. The guards assigned to the outing were genuine palace staff, but the carriage that arrived to collect them at the garden's outer gate, driven by men in unfamiliar livery, was not. It was Nora who first noticed something was wrong, arriving late to the garden to bring Milo his midday meal and finding the usual guards missing entirely, replaced by no one at all, the garden path empty and silent, in a way it should never have been at that hour. Her scream brought the palace guard running within minutes, but minutes, in matters of a kidnapped child, could mean everything. Draven received the news in the middle of a council meeting, and the room went utterly silent at the transformation that swept over him. The careful, controlled king vanishing in an instant, replaced by something far older and far more dangerous. The raw, protective fury of an alpha whose family had been threatened beneath his own roof. He was moving before the messenger had even finished speaking, calling for his personal guard, for trackers, for every wolf in the palace capable of running down a scent before the trail went cold. Lyra, informed only moments later, felt the entire world narrow down to a single, unbearable point of terror. Her brother, her Milo, who had survived fever and hunger and the loss of both parents, taken from a garden that was supposed to be safe, by hands that meant him nothing but harm. I am coming with you, she told Draven, meeting him at the palace gates where the tracking party had already begun to assemble. Lyra, it is not safe. He is my brother, she said, and the fierce, unshakable steel in her voice left no room for argument. I did not survive everything I survived to sit safely inside these walls, while someone else decides whether he lives or dies. I am coming. Draven looked at her for a long moment, torn between the instinct to protect her from danger and the recognition, hard won over the past weeks, that Lyra Hale had never once needed to be protected from her own courage. He nodded once, sharply, and helped her onto the horse beside his own. The trail led north, away from the palace grounds and into the wilder forest that bordered the Vane family's own extensive lands, and Draven's trackers, wolves with senses honed by years of border patrol, followed the scent of the forged carriage with a grim, focused determination that ate up the distance far faster than any ordinary horse could have managed. They found the carriage abandoned in a small clearing, an hour's hard ride from the palace, and beside it, in a rough hunting cabin, clearly prepared in advance for exactly this purpose, they found Milo, frightened but unharmed, bound but not otherwise hurt, guarded by two of Lord Vane's men, who had clearly not expected the king's own tracking party to arrive so quickly. What followed happened fast, the kind of fast that left little room for fear, only instinct and training taking over where thought could not keep pace. Draven moved first, closing the distance to the cabin door in a burst of speed that mirrored the very same instinct that had once carried him across a crowded ballroom floor to catch a falling stranger, and the confrontation that followed was brief, decisive, and entirely one-sided. Trained wolves loyal to the king against two frightened, outmatched men who had clearly believed their plan would succeed through stealth rather than confrontation. Neither guard managed so much as a single blow before they were subdued and bound in turn. Lyra was through the cabin door moments later, ignoring every instruction to stay back, and the sight of her brother, tied but alive, tears streaming down his frightened face the moment he saw her, broke something open in her chest that felt like it might never fully close again. Lyra. Milo's voice cracked as she cut through his bindings with shaking hands, pulling him into her arms the instant he was free. "I have you," she said, over and over, into his hair, rocking him gently, the way she had rocked him through every fever and every hard winter of their entire life together. "I have you. You are safe. I have you." Draven watched them, something fierce and tender warring behind his eyes, before turning his attention to the bound guards, his voice dropping into the low, dangerous register that had made even the fiercest border enemies think twice before challenging him. "Who sent you?" Neither man spoke, at first, loyalty or fear, keeping their mouths closed, even in the face of a king's fury. But it did not take long, in the end, for the truth to surface, for one of them, younger and less committed to his employer's cause than the other, to confess that Lord Ambrose Vane had promised them a small fortune to take the boy and hold him quietly, not to harm him, only to use him as leverage, a message intended to convince the new queen and her king that the Vane family's reach extended further than either of them had realized, and that crossing them carried a cost no crown could fully protect against. It was a foolish, desperate plan, born of wounded pride rather than careful strategy, and it ended, that same evening, with Lord Ambrose Vane, arrested in his own home, and brought before the council to answer for treason against the crown, a crime that carried consequences far more severe than the disgrace his daughter had already suffered. The Vane family's holdings were stripped, their standing in the court erased entirely, and Lord Vane himself sentenced to exile from the realm, along with every member of his household who had participated in the plot, a punishment the council delivered swiftly, and without a single voice raised in protest. Lyra carried Milo home herself, refusing to let him out of her arms for the entire ride back to the palace, and though the terror of that afternoon would linger in quieter moments for weeks to come, a small, hard kernel of fear that took time to soften, she found, holding her brother close as the palace gates finally came into view, that the events of that terrible day had taught her something she had not expected to learn. She was no longer simply Lyra Hale of the Hollow Pack, a poor Omega trying to survive on the margins of a world that had never made room for her. She was a woman who had ridden into danger for the people she loved, and had come out the other side with her family whole, and her enemies finally, fully answered for. Whatever fear the court's whispers or Celine Vane's schemes, or Lord Vane's desperate final gamble had once managed to plant in her heart, none of it remained now, burned away entirely by the fierce, unshakable knowledge of exactly what she was capable of protecting. She was ready, at last, to become queen. The coronation took place on a clear autumn morning, the kind of morning where the light seemed to fall more gently over the palace grounds, gold and soft, as though the whole world had agreed to be kind for a single day. The great hall, once the site of Lyra's collapse, then the site of her enemy's disgrace, and later the site of the trial that had tested every part of her strength, had been transformed once more, filled now with flowers, gathered from every corner of the realm, and lined with representatives from every pack, great and small, come to witness the crowning of a queen, whose story had, by now, traveled far beyond the palace walls. Word of the poor Omega who had fainted from hunger and won the heart of the Alpha King, who had survived a court's cruelty and a council's trial, and a desperate kidnapping, without once losing herself in the process, had spread through every corner of the Wolf Nation, carried by traders and travelers and the simple, irresistible pull of a story that felt, to ordinary people struggling through ordinary hardships of their own, like proof that fate did not only smile on those born into wealth and comfort. Lyra stood at the entrance to the great hall, dressed in a gown of deep, simple blue threaded through with silver, no ornament beyond what suited her, no attempt to disguise the girl she had been in order to better play the role of the queen she was becoming. Nora stood beside her, adjusting the final fold of her gown, with hands that trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from a pride too large to hold steady. "Your mother would be so proud of you," Nora said quietly, her eyes bright. "I only wish she could see this day." "She is here," Lyra said, and found that she believed it, in the quiet, certain way a person believes things that cannot be proven, but feel true all the same. "In everything I do, she is here." Milo, fully recovered now, healthy and strong in a way that still sometimes brought tears to Lyra's eyes, when she caught herself watching him run through the palace gardens without the shadow of fever hanging over him, took his place at the front of the gathered crowd, dressed in a small formal coat that made him look, Lyra thought, achingly grown up for a boy who had so recently been fighting for his life in a small, cold house in a forgotten valley. The doors opened, and Lyra walked the length of the great hall alone, her steps steady despite the weight of every eye in the realm turned toward her, and found, waiting at the far end beneath the dais where she had once been carried unconscious in the arms of a stranger, Draven, standing tall in the formal robes of his office, watching her approach with an expression of such open, unguarded warmth that the last of her nerves dissolved entirely before she had even reached him. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of ritual and ancient words, the Council of Elders, Corvin Ashgrove among them, presiding over the formal rites with a solemnity that had, weeks earlier, felt like judgment, and now felt instead like genuine honor. A crown of silver, simple and unadorned, the same style worn by every queen before her stretching back centuries, was placed upon her head, and the great hall erupted into applause that shook the very chandeliers overhead. No thin, doubtful clapping this time, but something full and genuine, and entirely without reservation. Draven took her hands in his, in front of the entire assembled realm, and spoke the final words of the ceremony, in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the hall. "3 months ago, I caught a stranger falling in this very room, and I have not once, since that moment, regretted refusing to let her go. Today, I do not simply crown my queen. I honor the woman who taught this entire realm what true strength looks like, who proved, through every trial placed before her, that worth is never measured by wealth or birth, but by the size of a person's heart and the depth of their courage." He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so simple and so tender that a hush fell over the entire hall. "Lyra Ashwood, my queen, my mate, my equal in every way that matters. I will spend the rest of my life making certain you never go hungry, never go unheard, and never once doubt how deeply you are loved." Lyra, tears finally slipping free despite every effort to hold them back, could not find words equal to the moment, and so she simply stepped forward and let him pull her close. Let the entire realm witness the embrace of a king and queen whose bond had been tested by hunger and cruelty and danger, and had emerged from every single trial stronger than before. That evening, long after the formal celebrations had ended and the great hall had emptied of its glittering crowds, Lyra stood on a private balcony overlooking the palace gardens, the silver crown still resting on her head, and felt Draven's arms wrap around her from behind, warm and solid, and entirely, permanently hers. "Do you remember," he murmured against her hair, "what you told me, that first night, when I asked why no one in your pack had made certain you ate?" "I remember," she said softly. "I said we managed." "You did more than manage," Draven said. "You survived a life that should have broken you, and you did it while protecting everyone around you, and you never once asked for anything in return." He turned her gently to face him, his gray eyes soft in the moonlight. "I intend to spend the rest of my life, making certain you never have to manage alone again." Below them, in the gardens, Milo's laughter drifted up on the evening air, chasing fireflies with a joy so complete It made Lyra's chest ache with a happiness she had once believed was reserved for other people, people born into easier lives than her own. She thought of the girl who had walked 3 hours in blistered shoes to a ball she had never wanted to attend, who had fainted from hunger on a cold marble floor, with no one in the world to catch her. She thought of the king who had caught her anyway, and had never once let go. And standing there, wrapped in his arms beneath a sky full of soft autumn stars, wearing a crown that had been earned through hunger and courage and love, rather than simply given by birth, Lyra Ashwood understood, at last, that every hardship she had ever survived had only been leading her here, to this moment, to this man, to a family finally whole, and finally, completely safe. She was no longer the forgotten girl from the Hollow Pack. She was queen. She was loved. And she was, for the very first time in her entire life, exactly where she belonged.